Good afternoon and welcome to the MindsetGo radio show. I'm your host, Mark Altman. Good to be back here and hope you're having a great afternoon thus far. And MindsetGo, the MindsetGo radio show is all about three kinds of intelligence: emotional intelligence, conversational intelligence, and multi-generational intelligence. Basically, we help people become more confident and effective communicators by learning how to have difficult conversations, by learning how to be more self-aware and in control of their reactions, and to better get along with the different generations in the workplace. We help people at work, at home, in schools, and today, after spending some time this week helping some people on this issue, we're going to talk about validation and why people want to be validated and why it's important for people to be validated. And for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with what I'm talking about, the question is, am I doing it right or am I doing it wrong? And a lot of people seek validation different ways. Some people seek it through others. It's probably the most common way people seek validation is through others. And what's funny about that is that there are so many different ways you can seek validation through others. You know, there's such a presence on social media these days, as we all know. And, you know, when you do a post on social media and you get a thumbs up, that's validation, right? How many people respond to your post? How many people like your post? That's a form of validation. When you send someone a joke and they send you an LOL back, that's a form of validation that your joke is funny. So those are some digital forms of validation. But the reason why we ask for validation most often is because we're just not that confident in what we're saying, what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and what we're doing. And if you're not confident in those things, it can create a lot of stress and anxiety. So validation is actually really important as a way, and look, even if your first choice is to have others validate you, it's better than seeking no validation at all, because as I've talked about on past shows, that communication ambiguity of not knowing where you stand, of not knowing what people think, is daunting. So, as we explore validation today, one of the misconceptions around validation is when you validate someone's feelings or thoughts or ideas, it actually means you're agreeing with them. And when you validate someone's ideas, if someone shares an opinion with you or shares an argument or a defense or something with you and you don't agree with it, and you say, yes, I can understand why you're saying that, that's a form of validation. It doesn't mean you agree with it. It really means you understand, based on their template, based on their life experience, why they might have that perspective. And a lot of people, when it comes to good communication, are hesitant to validate someone else's opinion or thoughts because they feel like that empowers them and means that they agree with them. And that's an area where I see a lot of breakdown, especially between leaders and their staff, because they don't want to put the impression out there that excuses can be validated or that ideas can be validated, especially if they're not that relevant or meaningful. But I digress. I want to get back to what your other choices are for validation. You know, if you don't seek other people's approval for validation, it means you have to get that validation on your own. So one of the questions I used to ask my son's 24, my oldest son is 24, and when he used to get jobs when he was in high school and college, and he'd come home from the job, I'm like, how's the job going? And he would say, it's going great. And I say, how do you know? And he said, I don't know, it just feels that way. And I used to be so confused. I used to say, well, what do you mean it just feels that way? There has to be some kind of measurement so you know if you're doing well or if you're not. And I said to him, you should ask your boss, how am I doing? How are things going? And he agreed. But then the problem came up with, if you're asking for validation, is there a certain amount of time that you should be asking for that validation? I mean, a frequency. So if he asks his boss every day, is that too much? If he asks his boss every week, is that too much? I don't know what the right answer of frequency is. I just know that I don't think seeking validation from other people is a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea if it's the only way you seek validation, or it's the only way you try to be validated is through other people. So he ended up finding out a lot of useful information by asking a superior, how am I doing? If the answer is yes, how come? If the answer is not as good as I'd hoped, how come? So it's not just asking the question, it's understanding why the answer to the question is what it is. But when it comes to seeking validation, how do you build your own template? How do you build a template that says, here's how I know? Now, I was working with some high school athletes yesterday, and one of the points I asked them is this expression, do my best. So I said, when you say you try your hardest or do your best, how do you know you've actually done those things? Like, what is your measuring stick for saying I did that? Because let's face it, from an expectation point of view, an athlete could think they've tried their hardest or done their best, and the coach or the parent could think very differently. So one of the athletes answered, if I have absolutely no energy, not an ounce of energy left at the end of the game, if I'm sucking wind, if I'm sore after. So if they've taxed their body in such a way that they're out of energy or they're sore, that was the way they validated working hard and trying their best. And I thought that was a really interesting answer. I get that. I mean, I think those are two actually really good examples of validating effort, right? But that's physical effort. Right? And there's multiple aspects to effort besides physical effort. There's mental effort and there's emotional effort. So let's talk about mental effort for a moment. How do you validate that you've given your all mentally? Well, first of all, it comes to being present and being mindful. When you're at practice or when you're at a game, are you fully present and focused on the task at hand? And that's just not winning the game or putting forth your best performance. It's knowing your role on the team and knowing your specific job and how you can best contribute. And are you focused on executing your job and your level of contribution to the best it can be because you're blocking out all the distractions? So there's a level of focus, there's a level of mindfulness that you need to have, because if you're exerting as much physical effort as you can, but you're not necessarily exerting the mental effort, then it's incomplete. And then there's the emotional intelligence aspect, the emotional effort, right? What does that mean? Well, what it means is that when you compete in anything in life, certainly in sports, but when you compete in the workplace, you're going to face adversity. You're going to face down times. And so do you actually have coping strategies and mechanisms to be resilient and to bounce forward from those situations? That's a part of trying your hardest and doing your best. So, you can see there's really three different components here. Have you taxed your body to the best you can to give full physical effort? Are you present and mindful to understand the specific role you play and contribution you're going to make to your team or to your success, and focused and clear on that? And then the emotional effort, which is your ability to fight through adversity, show good body language, lift up your teammates, be self-aware, be under control so you can respond and not react. So that's why it's a tricky question. When you talk about, what does trying your hardest and doing your best mean, and feeling like you're validating your own effort, there really are multiple components to the effort. And to bring this full circle, before we go into our first break, I'll wrap up with this thought. One of the challenges in validation is people aligning expectations. And I've talked about this on past shows. It's very difficult to align expectations unless they're articulated and agreed upon. And so what happens is a lot of times there's a communication disconnect, because if someone feels like they gave full effort and then they go seek approval for that full effort and they don't get it, that starts a level of frustration, disappointment, confusion, because you might have thought you gave full physical effort, but they were looking for a mental and emotional effort. So and we're going to explore this in our next segment, part of being validated is aligning expectations to know what you're being validated on and what you're being validated for. So this is Mark Altman for the Mindset Go radio show. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to the Mindset Go radio show. I'm your host, Mark Altman, founder, trainer, coach, and consultant from Mindset Go. And we're talking about validation today and all the different aspects that go with being validated. And right before the break, I was talking about, what you're being validated on and for. And I wanted to talk about a topic that freaks so many people out, and that's public speaking. And I was thinking the other day, one of my favorite things to do is to coach people when they do presentation public speaking. And it's really such a great fear for people. And one of the reasons I've always felt like it is such a huge fear for people is because they don't actually know how to do it well, and they don't really prepare for it well. And I always say that if there's anything you're trying to get better at that you don't prepare for properly, you're probably not going to look forward to doing it, and you're probably going to be dread it and be scared of it. But when it comes to public speaking, so many people get up there, and you're really seeking approval from an entire audience. And that audience could be as little as one or two people, or that audience could be hundreds of people. And so how do you get that approval? So it's interesting to me when I do motivational speaking and keynote speaking, I'll often have clients say to me, well, how will we know that your speaking was effective? And one of the comments I make is, well, if people come up to you after the fact and say he was a great speaker, that's actually not what I'm striving for. That's not what I feel validated by if someone tells me I'm a great speaker. The way I feel validated if someone comes up and says to me that because of what you said, I'm now confident, comfortable, and or motivated to act on a behavior or an approach or a strategy that prior to my speaking, they weren't. So think about that for a moment. My presentation, my motivational and inspirational communication got them to be confident, comfortable, and or motivated to act on a behavior that they weren't normally doing or weren't doing before I spoke. So that's how I feel validated. Because the thing about public speaking, there's so many aspects to it, right? First of all, are you engaging an audience? Are you keeping them interested? So am I looking out in the crowd? And for those of you who have done speaking and presentations and listening to this, you know what I'm talking about. If you're looking out in the crowd and you scan the crowd and you see people in the crowd yawning, playing with their phone, not really paying attention to what you're saying, that could be really devalidating. As a matter of fact, one of the comments I make to teachers is when you look, or trainers for that matter, when you look across a classroom, how do you know that what you're doing is having impact or affecting the audience? In other words, how can you validate that the content and the style that you're teaching is relevant and meaningful? And I've always gotten a handful of answers. Probably one of the best answers I've got was that a teacher said they look across each section of the room, and if there's someone that looks disengaged in each section of the room, that's a clue to me that they're not doing a good job. But at the end of the day, a lot of people, when they teach public speaking and presentation, will tell you how important it is to engage the audience, how important it is to interact with the audience, which is clearly, that's very important. But I would say that that's important, but the primary validation for a speaker is to get the audience to act or to buy into what you're saying or to willing to follow along with your suggested approach. In sales, how do you validate that your presentation was good? Talk to salespeople and sales leaders about this all the time. You go on a presentation, and most people get validated on a sales presentation through body language. The person's nodding their head and smiling, and really the prospect really seems to be buying into what you're saying. 2, they're actually acknowledging by their words that they like what you're saying. 3rd, they could be using reflective listening and parroting back to you what they're hearing, why they think it's relevant, instead of you telling them what the most important selling points or what the value adds are. They're actually saying it as in response to your presentation. So all those things can be really validating for a salesperson. And that's typically what a salesperson's looking for. But again, in the same comparison to public speaking, ultimately the salesperson feels validated if the person buys from them, right? So did you get the deal or didn't you? The challenge with validation here is that if you attach validation to income, you really are playing with your confidence. Because if I do everything right, whatever that is, like, am I defining what, again, from a validation perspective, am I defining what's right, or is the prospect defining what's right? You know, I've been doing sales and leadership for 25 years. So at this point, I have a pretty good feel. I mean, I teach it for a living. But at this point, I have a pretty good feel of the right approach. Now, that doesn't mean I always execute the right approach. That doesn't mean I don't have moments where I have bad habits or am not mindful of what I should be doing correctly. But I generally have an idea of what the right approach is. So if I execute that approach, but I don't get validated by the prospect, what's my takeaway? Is my takeaway I need to change and do things differently? Is my takeaway that, well, I got to stick with this approach because it served me well way more often than not? But we have a decision. Our inner voice in that moment makes a decision. And the problem is, if our inner voice doesn't, if our validation is attached only to an outcome, then the inner voice has such a high level of standard that it's almost always going to tell you you failed or you did something wrong. Just like in the case of a public speaking, if you've delivered a presentation that the last 10 times you've delivered this presentation, the audience has raved about it, they've acted on what you've asked, they've followed your call to action, and they've done everything, and on the 11th time, the presentation doesn't achieve your end goal or falls flat, do you not feel validated? And so I'm bringing up a different aspect of validation, one that's rarely discussed, which is attaching your need and wanting to be validated to an outcome versus consistent, reliable, proven behaviors and habits. And very often, when I do something professionally as a coach, trainer, or consultant, I work with people who don't have the capacity or the skill set or mindset to execute what I'm asking. So I can look at something like that and I can say, well, boy, I'm really not good at my job. Or I can say, this person, I could be the greatest trainer in the world, but they don't really have the capacity, tool set, and or skill set to act on what I'm asking. So that doesn't mean I'm not doing my job. It just means that it's not going to work with this person based on where they're at. And I think that's really important because there is a third option here. And the third option here is, if I recognize that that person doesn't have the skill set, tool set, or capability, that middle option is, can I adapt my approach? Do I adapt my approach so I can meet them where they are? And we live in a society where everything tends to be black and white. But it's not. Most things aren't black and white. And so if it's either, hey, they can't do it or I didn't do it, again, from an inner voice and a mindset perspective, it's going to produce more disappointment and affect your confidence. If you seek a middle ground and understand that there is a third alternative in many cases, that can be a different way to not only be validated, but have a growth mindset and really boost your confidence to know that there's another skill you can learn to even take your skill set to a higher level. So when we come back, we're going to expand on that, and we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about confirmation bias when it comes to validation. So this is Mark Altman for the Mindset Go Radio Show. We'll be back after the break. Okay, welcome back to the Mindset Go Radio Show. I'm your host, Mark Altman, today talking about validation, the psychology behind seeking validation, and why you need it, and why you want it, right? And so we talked in the first segment about different ways to seek validation. We talked about how and why and when you go to other people and in what examples to seek validation. But there's another reason why we seek validation, and that is something called confirmation bias. And what's funny about confirmation bias is a lot of people love to say that they're open-minded. But even the most open-minded people, it is still difficult to hear people that have contrary opinions of you. And if you think about it, if you take a step back, we mostly hang out with people that have similar values, similar thought processes, tastes, and people that agree with you. And that's okay. We want to have fulfilling relationships. We want to feel loved by friends and family. And one of the reasons that's the best example of this is politics. And now more than ever, there's such a disconnect with people all over the country in politics, right? And so we tend to hang out with people we like and agree with, right? So confirmation bias is the tendency to ask people for their opinions, thoughts, and ideas that confirm your thought process. So you'll go to someone who you're likely assuming is going to agree with you and see your point of view. So it confirms your hypothesis. And the people you're going to very often will ignore the facts that violate your ideologies. They'll just agree with you, not just to agree with you because they have a similar thought process to yours. And what's interesting to me about confirmation bias is sometimes, and in many cases, I don't think people realize that that's what they're doing. I think sometimes they go about going to someone and running something by them to say, what do you think about this? But there's another aspect of confirmation bias, even if it's an unconscious thing that you're doing, and that is leading people. So I often, when I'm seeking a different perspective or a third opinion, I often will go out of my way and be mindful before I present the information to someone not to lead them. Because, again, even if you're going to someone who doesn't necessarily have your values and ideals, but if the way you present the information is going to lead them, that can also create confirmation bias. So here's an example. If you feel wronged or accused, and you start out a conversation with someone and says, you're never going to believe what this guy did to me. I got to hear your opinion on this. Well, if you start out with, you're never going to believe what this person did to me, the assumption is that you need empathy, and you're seeking empathy, and you're seeking empathy or sympathy. And so you've created, before you've even shared the story, you created an opportunity for confirmation bias. And what's interesting is that what it means from a validation perspective if someone doesn't agree with you. And let's face it, this is a situational awareness example, because in some cases, if someone doesn't agree with you, that's okay. You feel better off because you feel more knowledgeable because someone else did share a different perspective or an opinion. The problem is, in many cases, if someone doesn't agree with you, it could be a foundational confidence thing for you that really impacts how you approach certain topics moving forward. So for instance, I really believe in my heart, through all the studying I've done and curriculum I've developed, that emotional intelligence and the 5 aspects of emotional intelligence are central to human success and happiness. Well, if I was to ask someone that I think is really knowledgeable about where they think emotional intelligence stacks up, and that person says, geez, I got to be honest, Mark, I think it's important, but I could think of 3 things that are more important from a personal or professional development perspective. You know, I've built a lot of my company success and training and coaching on emotional intelligence. So if someone I respected and trusted gave me that feedback, that could make me second guess myself. And so I might be inclined to avoid asking the question in fear of the answer I'm going to get, right? So confirmation bias is you're asking the question to someone who you think will confirm your thought process. But then there's the opposite, which is avoiding the asking the question because you have a fear of the answer, right? No one ever thinks of that aspect when it comes to confirmation bias, but that's the opposite. And information is knowledge, right? I'd like to think, at least this is the feedback I've gotten from so many people, I'd like to think that not only am I open-minded, I think I go out of my way to seek people's opinions. And I'm sure in some cases there's confirmation bias, and I know in cases there's not confirmation bias. But this is a way I validate myself. And I don't have a set formula that says, you know, if I ask 10 people and 7 people validate my opinion, then that's the right approach or that's the right way to do it. But it's a little different. I look at it as, how can I be a better professional and a better person, you know, by gaining certain knowledge and information that I know is going to allow me to better relate and connect and motivate people. So when you talk about confirmation bias, I think that understanding what does open-minded actually mean? Does open-minded mean, is it a temporary state? Is it a permanent state? Is it something when someone says you're open-minded, if you get what a great compliment. If someone were to describe you as open-minded, that's a pretty big compliment in our society. You're open to hearing different perspectives, opinions, right? But is anybody open-minded about everything? You know, if someone were to come talk to me about a politician that I couldn't stand, you know, I might be the most open-minded person on some things and most things, but maybe not on politicians. And I think we're a society that is frequently giving labels to people. And in many cases, those labels are intended to be positive. This person is extroverted. This person is open-minded. This person is easy to get along with, right? Those are great compliments. Certainly in our society, those are great compliments. But then if we use words like, this person's introverted, this person's opinionated. Okay, look at those 2 words, introverted and opinionated. Are those ever associated with positive? And let's take opinionated first. Opinionated could mean you're just assertive and articulate when addressing your thoughts and feelings. But most people would be like, oh no, they're opinionated, they're going to argue, they might embrace conflict. So it's a label. Introverted, no one goes around saying, oh, this person's introverted, isn't that wonderful? But introverted could mean thoughtful, careful in how you process information, mindful. I mean, introverted could mean a lot of different things. But we give these labels. And again, nothing is black and white. Everything has to be black and white. It's either a positive attribute or it's a negative attribute. I've said time and again that no one is extroverted all the time and no one is introverted all the time. And frankly, when you label someone, it's only from your point of reference and your experience. So if you say someone's easy to get along with, that could mean that because of your personality and how you mesh with that person, you see them as easy to get along with. But it doesn't actually mean they're easy to get along with. And this is why validation is such a broad topic, because it's one thing to validate you. It's one thing to validate, am I doing a good job or not doing a good job? Am I doing it right or am I doing it wrong? It's another thing to validate your opinions, right? About things, about people, right? And when you go to validate your opinions, it's a huge opportunity to influence. And when we come back for our final segment of the show, we're going to talk about how validation can be used as a tool of influence. So this is Mark Altman for the Mindset Go radio show. Stay with us as we come back for our final segment. Welcome back to the Mindset Go radio show, the final segment today about validation. And so far, we've really covered a lot of ground. You know, we talked a little in the beginning about the different ways you can seek validation. Am I doing it right or am I doing it wrong? Validating your opinions about things and people. We talked about confirmation bias. We talked about the opposite of confirmation bias, not asking the question for fear of confirming what you think the answer might be or the worst. And we talked about how to validate as a public speaker or as a presenter in sales. You know, and before we just cover this last topic, just want to reinforce that one of the main areas we help people is how to build that template, that internal template to know how they can validate their performance or how they can validate their behavior and habits. Because so much of the reason we go to other people is because we don't have that internal template to know how to be successful. And because we attach validation so often to outcomes. And you know, one of the things you see on sales teams all the time is the person who's the top producer on the sales team or the people who exceed quota are often validated. They're the best people on the team. And so again, so much of the show today I've talked about everything has to be black and white, but it shouldn't. And there's so much gray area. And if we attach validation to outcomes all the time, it makes it very difficult to achieve a real internal template of success, performance, and confidence. So we've covered a few different areas, and there's a lot that we want to be validated on. We want to be validated on what we're saying, what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and what we're doing. So that's why I chose this topic today, because I just think there's such a need and want for us to be validated with situations and with people that having that internal template is critical. And if you've struggled to get that validation in the workplace or get this validation in some aspect of your life, please reach out to me because I'm happy to help, and it's part of what I do to help people build their confidence. With that said, let's go to our final piece of validation, which is influence. So one of the areas companies use validation all the time is marketing in their website. So when you look at how companies use validation, they're looking at, right? Google Analytics, website analytics, social media analytics to validate if the strategy and the approach they're taking is working. And so they're looking at data and statistics to understand if the approach they're taking is the right approach, which is fine. But there are so many mitigating factors that the data alone is not necessarily the sole factor for validation. We see with websites, there's something called A/B testing, which you email out or have people sample different landing pages to see who's clicking on what and the engagement level of the landing page itself. And those are really important factors, right? So in marketing, whether it's email marketing campaigns, whether it's nurture campaigns, A/B testing, analytics, those are all different approaches companies take to validating their marketing efforts. But what's really interesting to me is how an effort to validate can really be a form of influence. And I'll give you a great example. A lot of companies have what are called customer advisory boards. And so they use either big customers or their most long-standing, tenured, or loyal customers to give feedback and validation on product innovation, marketing strategy, business ideas, and they use this customer advisory board. And the reason why I say it's a form of influence is because if you receive a call from somebody and the company says to you, hey, you're important enough, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously it may not be phrased this way, but you're important enough, we want your opinion, you're a loyal customer, you're an important customer, but most of all, you're really smart and knowledgeable, so we want to pick your brain on what we're doing. And so there's an attempt at validation where the person on the other end of the phone is feeling like $1 million and feeling like, wow, I have so much to say and share that they've actually called on me. So in a case like that, seeking validation from other people can be used as a tool of influence. And what's interesting is so much of what happens in business is companies and salespeople and marketing people only reach out to their clients when they need or want something. Whether they're trying to upsell business, whether they need to ask a question, whether they're reacting to a concern from a client. But calling up a client, seeking validation on an idea, strategy, product innovation, something like that, empowers the client to feel like a part of the team, to feel important, to feel valued. And so that's one of the two ways I have often seen validation used as a tool of influence. Now, the other way it's used as a tool of influence is to plant a seed, set a precedent, set the tone. So if you're a leader at a company and you feel you may be having some culture issues or engagement issues, and you're exploring different ideas to solve that problem, and you float out, hey, I understand things aren't where we want them to be, our revenue's down, whatever the challenge is, and here's what we're thinking. We're thinking of allowing more employees to work at home. We're thinking of offering professional development as a perk. We're thinking of having more group work and working in teams. And so these ideas are floated out there, but they're floated out there, I believe, genuinely, so employees can share their opinions and thoughts and how meaningful those ideas are, but they're also being used as a tool to plant a seed to get people at the company to know that something's being done. And there's discussions behind the scenes. And in most cases, I'd like to think that those are genuine and those are actually happening. But a lot of times with companies, you don't see the follow-through. And there isn't actually something happening behind the scenes, but it's being used as a tool to include and empower and have people validate what works and what doesn't. But that's another example of how validation can be used as a tool of influence. And so what's the takeaway from today? The takeaway from today is ultimately your best form of validation is a hybrid. It starts out with you having an internal template and process to know when you perform, when you interact with other human beings, in relationships, in tasks, what is your internal process to know, hey, I did the right thing, I'm doing a good job, my idea is spot on, or it isn't. That's part one. And most people do not really have a process or habits to really create that internal validation. Then there's the external validation, which is asking other people. And there are 3 buckets of people you can ask. You can do the confirmation bias that we talked about earlier and tend to ask the people that share your morals, your values, your thoughts, knowing subconsciously or consciously they'll agree with you. The second thing you can do is ask people, colleagues, that you're not really clear where they would stand on the matter. So there is no confirmation bias, right? And then the third thing you can do is find people who may be experts on the subject matter that are really qualified to give you validating feedback. So you can call on any or all of those people, but it's not just as simple as picking a random person. It's something you have to be thoughtful about, who you're going to choose to validate, which groups of people you're dating. So there's the internal validation and there's the external validation, right? And then the last component of validation is the why. Why are you needing the validation? Because sometimes you might think you need it, but you don't actually need it. And often people seek validation because they don't trust their gut. They've had bad experiences. They're being very protective. They don't want to get caught with their pants down, so to speak. And so it's more of a protective measure. So if you're seeking that validation, I would have you ask yourself, why do you need the validation? Do you actually need the validation? Because in some cases, it might cause you more trouble than it's worth. And by constantly seeking the validation, it's going to tell your inner voice is going to tell you you don't know how to build that confidence on your own, and you always need the help. So those are the big takeaways from the show today. And for more information about training in the areas of leadership, sales, employee engagement, company culture, around emotional and conversational and multi-generational intelligence, what a mouthful that is, please reach out to me, Mark Altman at MindsetGo. You can email at info@mindsetgo.com, or certainly reach out at 978-206-1535. Hope you have a wonderful Thursday afternoon. We will see you next time for the Mindset Go radio show.